You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too, now added bonus for free. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. Today we're going to be doing an introduction to theology. This will not be a basic baby level introduction to theology. It's going to be pretty heady, but still an introduction nonetheless. We're going to look at Genesis 1. And since Jordan Peterson and so many other people begin their talks in Genesis, and because I think that we can give a better account of what's going on in Genesis, we're going to start there. We're going to start in Genesis 1 and eventually probably work our way up through. This has been requested for many, many years now at Jay's Analysis. For about 3 years now, people have said, start doing talks on Genesis and, the rest of Scripture. And we've been doing that, and that doesn't mean that we're stopping our discussions of the Globalist book series, but it means that we are going to take some detours. And the Jeremiah talk was very profitable. That came out pretty good. Everybody liked that. So we're going to move on to talking about creation and Genesis. And this is where we start. Obviously, Genesis is the book of origins, the first book of the law, the Torah, the books of Moses. And we have something unique in our view that is different from something like Roman Catholic theology, and that is that creation is a revealed doctrine. Just like all the other doctrines of Christianity, creation is revealed. It's not something that you can determine merely by looking outside at the natural world. The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit, Paul says, and thus he cannot accurately interpret the natural world. Now, that does not mean that he is without culpability. Paul says in Romans 1 that there is a natural testament within inside man himself, a sense of right and wrong, a moral law, even written on the hearts of all men, and that's because all men are made ultimately in the image of God. However, we all descend from Adam, and so we participate in his fall, and therefore our minds are darkened, our spirit is darkened, and our flesh is also subject to death. So we are cut off from the life of God until we return to God in the person of Christ. That was, of course, Christ's whole mission and purpose for coming. And it all begins with Genesis. You cannot accurately interpret the New Testament and redemption without a proper doctrine of creation. If you screw up your doctrine of creation, your doctrine of redemption is not going to make any sense. And this is why people who try to come up with alternate versions of how the world began, and they try to blend secular thought with what's mentioned in Genesis, and most of the time, 95% of the time, they reject what's in Genesis. They don't believe it's historical. Eventually, they lose the rest of their theology. The rest of it goes down the drain because they don't realize the stupidity and incoherence of the New Testament and its doctrine of Genesis, and its doctrine of Mosaic authorship, and its doctrine of the 7-day, 24-hour weeks that we all live by. We all live on the basis of a 7-day week, and this is based on Genesis, right? So the very weeks that we endure day in and day out testify to Genesis. But nobody sees this because they don't believe the Bible. But we're going to see that the Bible has a tremendous amount of historical veracity, but that's not going to be our proof. We don't rest our proof and our beliefs on the shifting sands of controlled social engineering academia. We base our beliefs on the authority of God himself, because God has laid this down. It's a self-attesting, and it is ultimately at the level of worldview commitments, a circular commitment. And that's why all worldview commitments ultimately are based on presuppositions of ultimate authority. For the secularists, it is human autonomy in an ultimately irrational universe. For us, it is the authority of God and ultimately a meaningful, purposeful universe. Two completely opposed worldviews. They are incommensurable. They do not mix. You cannot mix a universe created for the purpose of glorifying God on the basis of the divine mind, right, through the Logos. You cannot mix that with a completely incoherent, meaningless, nihilistic, pointless universe that just sprang out of nothing and that's going nowhere and that ends in nothing. And your life is merely an echo, a drop in the pond of nothingness and meaningless in that universe. Two completely different worldviews that do not mix. How foolish and stupid then for so-called Orthodox, so-called Christians, so-called believers who want to mesh their worldview with nonsense to try to be more palatable to people who hate you. You're never going to be palatable to your enemies. You're never going to be palatable. You're never going to convince secularists that your position is okay for them. No, you have to challenge their presuppositions. That's the key. That's what you have to do to convert anyone. So we don't begin our worldview with the authority of rebellious man, fallen man who does not have the Spirit and cannot understand the things of the Spirit. How is he going to tell us how the world began? He can't. He doesn't have the eyes and the lens to see the spiritual power of interpretation that is given through revelation and through inclusion into the church. So the natural man, as Paul says, is made foolish. The wisdom of this world is foolishness, and that's why it always ends in a bunch of nonsense. We don't take the scriptures seriously enough. When Paul says that the wisdom of this world ends in foolishness, it really does. It really does lead to nonsense, ridiculous positions. The most obvious of which are all of these rationalists and atheists and so-called scientists who sit around trying to disprove everything that we believe. Meanwhile, they at the same time teach a universe that is ultimately meaningless and purposelessness, right? Has no purpose, has no meaning. Therefore, their arguments and their lives have no purpose or meaning. It's completely self-refuting. It's made foolish from the outset. So we need to stop fearing what people think, and we need to stop being worried that our position is going to be made fun of. Of course it's going to be made fun of, but guess what? Their position is the really stupid one. Their position is the one that is actually liable to complete nonsense. Our position is coherent. They may not like it. It may not be the most palatable to them, but who cares? Who cares what they think? Right? It's what God thinks that matters. It doesn't matter what they think. And they don't know anything, right? They're lost chasing their own tails, caught up in social engineering, believing all the most ridiculous stuff, believing things that have absolutely no foundation at all, with no philosophy, no worldview, except whatever the so-called academic realm, which is completely controlled, completely fake, completely a scam, whatever they say, right? Whatever TV and academia say is what all of these haters believe. So they're actually the foolish ones. And it's once you learn our worldview, once you learn our position, it's not difficult to refute their nonsense. Their whole worldview is irrational and meaningless. And yet they spend their whole lives trying to use meaning and reason, things that don't make sense on their nihilistic atheist worldview, to try to refute the very thing that gives their worldview meaning, that gives their lives meaning, right? There's only meaning if God exists. There's only meaning if our worldview is true. And they use all of the weaponry of our worldview, things that only make sense on our worldview, the preconditions of our worldview, to try to destroy the very thing that gives them meaning. So in our view, you have there is some truth to the claim that, yes, Genesis 1 and 2 is not a, quote, scientific account, but that really just depends on what the word scientific means. If you mean, is God giving a detailed account of how he did each thing? No. It's a detailed account that he did each thing, but no, it's not like a science manual of how to create birds and how to create water, right? I mean, obviously it's not that. So when these people, and Jordan Peterson does this a lot, where he's like, it's not talking about how God did it. It's about why he did it. It's a myth. Well, okay, so what? That's not telling us anything. I mean, that's a content-less claim that nobody ever questioned anyway. Whoever thought that Genesis 1 and 2 was a scientific manual of how to create? Nobody ever thought that. And he says, oh, well, it's a myth. Okay, but it depends on how we define the word myth. Okay, I mean, in a way, it's a myth if you just mean by myth a story. But usually, I don't really like this terminology, because usually myth means falsehood. It means lies. But people try to use this to say, oh, well, Genesis is really just a mythological account. What do you mean? Do you mean that it's a lie? Well, no, then it's not a mythological account, because guess what? Jesus says it's historical. The Gospels read Genesis very clearly as history. The apostles read Genesis and Adam and Eve as history, right? They were historical people. They weren't myths. They weren't symbols. They were actual living people. There was an actual historical fall. So when, as I pointed out, listen to the talk with Tim Kelly about the Luciferian death cult. As I pointed out in that talk, when you become ahistorical, when you deny history in terms of Genesis, what you actually get is the whole Bible becoming ahistorical, right? People don't realize this because they're ignorant. They think they're being very intellectual and they're being very, quote, scientific. And then somebody else eventually down the line points out to them, doesn't the New Testament read Genesis this way? Oh, oops, it does. So I guess the New Testament is also full of errors when it says that stuff. And then your whole religion goes out the door. So the whole thing collapses. And people who, I guess these people are also just ignorant of the history of higher criticism itself, because higher criticism has already done this. We've already gone through this route. There were people 100 years ago that were already pointing out that if you deny Genesis, you also have to deny the New Testament texts that assume Genesis is history. And so that's where you get the Jesus quest, and you get the denial of not just the books of Moses, but also the New Testament writings. So the whole religion collapses because of idiots who thought that they would become more palatable to unbelievers who hate the religion to begin with. So it makes absolutely no sense. You're just destroying yourself. Anyway, so what we have in Genesis 1 is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, so there's a kind of a chaos here at the beginning. There is just the beginning of the existence of matter, perhaps. And darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered above the face of the waters. Now, for us, this is explained in the rest of Scripture. So we don't come to this verse and try to import to it our presuppositions about what we think ancient Near Eastern mythology meant. All right, this is the secular naturalist approach. This is the unbelieving approach. That's not what we do. The way we interpret this verse is through the lens of the rest of the Bible. And that's because for us, the Bible is a unified, coherent whole joined together by the covenants in Scripture. Each one of these covenants builds on the last, as I pointed out in my other biblical lectures that you can go listen to. And each one of these covenants is looking ahead to the coming of the Messiah. We do believe that there is a covenant here in Genesis. When God created the world, he entered into a covenant relationship with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve broke the covenant, and this brought sin, death, corruption, separation from God, right? Spiritual death, etc., etc. So there is going to be a covenant relationship here, not just between God and man, but between God and all of creation, with man as the steward or having dominion over this creation. This is why when man falls, The whole creation is affected by his rebellion. This is why death and corruption affects the entire created order. So for us, there is a kind of catastrophism early on in Genesis, early on in the Bible. It's not a natural state, right? In other words, the way things are is not the state of how things have always been. And this is very important, as we'll see here in a moment. But from the get-go, we have a kind of hinting at the triune God, the Trinity, even here in the first chapter. And this we don't make this up. We know this because of the revelation given to St. John in the New Testament in the book of John. Excuse me, as I was saying before motorcycles started driving by, Genesis 1 is mirrored in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then John goes on to explain that all things were made through Christ. Colossians 1:16 through 20 also describes the creation of all of reality by the Father, through the Son, and the Spirit. This is pretty much the standard Orthodox dictum of how the Trinity relates to creation at all times. The Father is the origin or source of the Godhead. The Son is the full expression of the Father in all senses of all of his glory and power, etc. And then all of this happens creationwards in the Spirit, and not just in the Spirit, but for all eternity. That's how God is manifested. Right? The Son proceeds from the Father. The Son is generated from the Father. The Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son for all eternity. And this relationship also relates to creation. So creation occurred from the Father as the origin, speaking the word of creation, the word being the Logos, the Son, all creation being done in the Son, through the Son, and then in the Spirit, right? So the triune God present here at creation, making the first creation, right, and hovering over the waters, the Spirit hovering over the waters. This for us is emblematic of baptism. So even from the beginning, God was pointing ahead to the new creation, where the Spirit of God is invoked and hovers over the waters of baptism to make us into new creations. So creation itself contains within it the mystery of redemption from the outset. The original creation is a type of the new creation. This is explained many times in the New Testament, over and over and over. See my essay, Logos, Creation, and the Wisdom of God, where I discuss the parallels between Genesis 1 and John 1. And so the wisdom of God that Proverbs describes as present at creation in Proverbs 8, this is Christ. Christ is the Logos and wisdom of God. And he is also the founding, the pillar of the church, who is also the wisdom and house of God, right? The church is the body of Christ. So we're going to see that in Genesis 1, there are multitudes of mysteries, parallels, and types that only make sense in regard to redemption, that only makes sense according to salvation and deification in Christ. Now, that does not mean that the fulfillments of the types are ahistorical or mythological, right? This is a fundamental misunderstanding. This is a trick, a bait and switch of higher critics and leftists who have for a long time said that because something is a symbol or a type, it therefore means it was not historical. No, it's not. There's absolutely no reason to say that. And if you listen to my critiques of Father Stephen Freeman, I cover that in about 3 hours, where his whole basis was that mistake, that false assumption. And the New Testament makes it very clear. Every time it talks about a type or typology, it's based on the history of the antitype, right? Type and antitype, or prototype, type, prototype, type, antitype. Either way you frame it, the original is historical, right? So in Galatians 4, when Paul gives the allegory of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, it doesn't mean that Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar are mythological, non-historical figures. Of course not. Paul says that the allegory is based on them being historical. When Adam is described as a type of Christ, right, both of them are historical. Jesus is just as historically human as Adam, right? That's the whole point of the incarnation, to undo what Adam did in the same breadth and scope as Adam's fall. Both are historical. And once you destroy the history of it, the whole religion falls apart. It should be common. That should be obvious. But of course, with these people, whether it's bad will or whether it's lack of faith or whether it's who knows what, whether they're infiltrators, it's hard to know people's motives all the time. Maybe they're just wrong. But I tend to think that no, it's not that hard to figure out that, if you deny Genesis, you also have to deny a whole bunch of the New Testament based on Genesis, right? That should logically follow. But for us, again, what we see at the beginning is the divine fiat, the divine word, creating out of nothing. And this is also crucial because this is something that makes our doctrine distinct from all the pagan religions. Christianity, Orthodox theology, is based on God creating out of nothing. This is stated many times in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It should not be a controversial doctrine. There are some New Agers and weirdos and Gnostics who try to say that the Bible teaches that there's eternal matter. No, it doesn't. That's ridiculous. Hebrews, Maccabees, right? All of these books, as well as the Psalms, teach that God created ex nihilo. In the Latin, that means out of nothing. So creation, as we said, is revealed. It's not a natural doctrine that you come to through contemplating and staring at the sky or staring at earthworms. That doesn't teach you that God created out of nothing. Ex nihilo is a revealed dogma, right? This is why all the pagan religions don't believe in ex nihilo. This is the stupidity of Thomism to think that Romans 1, for example, when it talks about creation testifying to a creator, that's not talking about philosophical arguments from Aristotle. That's talking about an inner, immediate testimony to the reality of God's existence and that you are a sinner. That's what Romans 1 says, right? Natural revelation is what we might properly term it, not natural theology. There's nothing in Romans 1 about philosophizing about a first cause and a series of infinite causes back to some original cause. That's not what Paul's talking about. He's talking about an inner sense of it being wrong to make idols and to worship creatures and to engage in homosexuality. That's what he says in Romans 1. He's not talking about Aristotle arguments. He's talking about it being wrong, and you know it's wrong. In your heart of hearts, humans know that it's wrong to engage in that activity, and they know because deep down they know that there's a God. Now, they don't know that God personally because they're fallen. They rebelled against him. We're born into a fallen state, what we call ancestral sin. But we have a faint sense of right and wrong and that there's a God. But our idea of God is confused with creation. And this is the root of idolatry. Idolatry is not just making an idol or a stick and saying that that's God or a totem pole. Idolatry is first and foremost a matter of the heart and the mind. It's forming a God in our mind that we want, right? So idolatry begins in the heart, and then it moves to the mind, where we attribute to things in the created order divinity, right? And so we confuse ourselves and we worship idols, and they can be anything, right? And they're not the creator, the one true God, who is not identified with creation. God is separate from creation, right? This is what Genesis 1 teaches us. So Genesis 1 teaches us that idolatry is wrong. Not just making sticks and stones and idols, but all forms of idolatry. There's nothing in the created order that is God. God is greater than all of the created things. And as St. Athanasius says, and against the heathen, it should be evident from creation that we should worship him alone and not any of the created things, because they all come and go. They die. We die. Why would we worship something that can't save us? Why would we worship things that come and go? that are in flux, that are going to pass away. They're obviously not God. But as Paul says in Romans 1, the universality of idolatry shows that we are all guilty due to the fact that we all, in some way, even if we grew up in a secular family and we don't have any idols anywhere, we don't have statues of Buddha or whatever, or pagan totem poles, we still believe that we are God. We worship ourselves, or we worship sex, or we worship money, or we worship something else in the place of God that takes on, that has taken root in our heart, right? And that is the root of idolatry. And so from the very beginning, we should know Genesis is teaching us that God is not a created thing. He's not part of the created order. He is separate from it, and that's why creation ex nihilo is so important. And that's also why this religion from the outset is distinct from all of the other ancient Near Eastern religions. The rest of them don't teach this. The rest of the ancient Near Eastern religions, and this is very popular amongst the Zeitgeist crowd or amongst Freemasons or amongst any of these heretical groups and ideas, is to say, oh, all the religions are the same. Christianity is the same as all the other religions around it. Judaism came out of ancient paganism, and it's just the same as all the... No, it's not. No, none of those other religions taught creation ex nihilo. Not one of them. None of them. All the pagan religions teach that creation is an accident or some result of some sex act of the gods. We don't teach that. And we don't teach that matter is eternal. We don't teach that God is an architect. No. Those are all pagan ideas that we reject. So from the outset, and the people just don't know this, when they start talking about the zeitgeist type crap, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know that we actually teach a very unique, distinct doctrine. The Bible teaches creation out of nothing, and none of the other pagan religions teach that. Right? So when Jordan Peterson starts talking about how this is mythology and it's not history, and he's already missing some of the key components that make Christianity stand out. So he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he should stop talking about the Bible, because it's not about Carl Jung and archetypes. That's not what the Bible is talking about. The Bible itself tells us what it's talking about. And then through the history and tradition of Orthodoxy, we have the fuller explanation, commentary, and expression of what our religion is about. We don't go to Carl Jung. We don't go to Charles Darwin. We don't go to Freud. And we don't go to Jordan Peterson. We go to the tradition of the Orthodox Church and the Bible. It tells us what it's talking about. So we also understand, this is very important, and the starting point of our religion is that because God is distinct from his creation, and because of ex nihilo, it means that there's no such thing as dualism. There's no equal force to God. It's not matter in competition with God. This is where Gnosticism starts. Gnosticism begins with an erroneous doctrine of creation. In the Gnostic sects and heresies, and if you don't know about this, go listen to my talk, Gnosticism Refuted, where I go to St. Irenaeus, and we cover his refutations of Gnosticism. Gnosticism begins with the idea of creation as an accident. Isn't that interesting? Because that's exactly what evolution teaches, right? All of these pagan doctrines seem to match up with Gnosticism and evolution. They all kind of tend to say the same thing, and none of them teach ex nihilo, right? So you get a kind of God versus matter view, or God versus the accidental abortion of creation. This is what the Gnostics describe creation as, an accidental abortion that happened, out of the being or essence, or some lower level God that accidentally created, right? All of that is nonsense. That's all mythological. The irony here is that while Jordan Peterson, for example, says that Genesis is mythological, and then he goes to Carl Jung and Gnosticism to try to make sense of things, evolutionary theory and Carl Jung and Gnosticism are about 75,000 times more ridiculous and mythological than what's in the Bible. This is so stupid. And it's the same with evolutionary theory, right? Naturalism is just as mythological. Naturalism, evolutionary naturalism, literally teaches the same thing as Zeus, right? The creation of mankind in the ancient Greek myths is that lightning struck the ground and it accidentally created man. Man is an accidental creation of natural forces. That's exactly what evolutionary theory teaches. And evolutionary theory is the exact same as ancient Hinduism, right? Egypt borrows the doctrines of ancient Hinduism. And modern evolutionary theory directly comes out of 1700s Freemasonry, quite literally. The Collins brothers have an excellent article where they actually cite many of the early proponents, T.H. Huxley, Ernst Haeckel, these characters, their derivation of where they got their theory out of the lodge, right? There's Masonic poems about evolution. Did you know that? Yes, from the 1700s and 1800s. And why is that? Because evolution just comes from ancient Greek paganism. And ancient Greek paganism just comes from ancient Egyptian and Hindu paganism. So it's all the same mythology. And what does it all go back to? The gods and accidental creation and chaotic forces. So notice that the Bible mentions ancient primal chaos in Genesis 1. Isn't that interesting? Ancient primal chaos, and God puts order on top of this chaos or the chaotic matter that he's already created. So God is already creating this primal matter state out of nothing, and then he imposes order on it. In all other worldviews, all other religions, all of them outside of our religion, the biblical revelation, chaos and disorder are preeminent over God and the ordering principle. You see, it's reversed. In our view, yes, there is a kind of primal chaotic matter at the beginning, a void, and then matter, and then God putting it into order over the next 7 days, the creation week. In every other worldview, it's reversed. And do you see how unique this is? Do you see how contrasted this is? This is why you can't mix Christianity with evolutionary theory or theistic evolution. It doesn't work because it reverses this process. It says that chaos and evolution happened, Big Bang, however you want to say it, and then God has to then work with the forces that are equal to him, co-equal to him, or he has to kind of organize them like an architect. This is why Freemasonry, just like Aristotle, speaks of God as the great architect. Did you know that Aristotle, his God, is the great architect? So how is Aquinas going to borrow and rip off a bunch of Aristotle when Aristotle's God is not this God? The Bible God is not Aristotle God. You can't blend these two. None of this stuff makes sense when it just gets more confused, and it all falls apart when you blend these two things. So again, chaos is not preeminent over God. The void is not preeminent over God. There's no goddess named Tiamat that is telling God what to do. No, that's all made up. It's all pagan. There's no competing force of dualism. It's not God fighting with matter to see who's preeminent. We're not Zoroastrians. There's no duality here. There's no light versus darkness here, equal, co-equal, or something like that. No, none of that is true. And that's the importance of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Creation ex nihilo automatically negates all forms of dualism, all forms of Gnosticism, and all forms of paganism from the outset. And every time somebody tries to re-interject that doctrine into Christianity of eternal matter, it's almost always coming out of people who are into Freemasonry. And it's not an accident that Judaism holds out the possibility of eternal matter, as does Freemasonry. Isn't that interesting? And that's because there's a similarity between the teachings of the Lodge and Judaism, or Talmudic, Pharisaic Judaism, we should say. So, already from the outset, the internet atheists, the internet zeitgeist apologists don't know what they're talking about. From the outset, they're wrong. From Genesis 1, 1 and 2, our presentation is completely unique. Now, I'm not saying that just because it's unique, it's true. That's not my argument. But I'm saying that all of those people don't know what they're talking about. They start their analysis by assuming that Genesis 1, oh, that's exactly the same as the Egyptian Memphite creation account. No, it's not. There is no similarity between the teaching of Atum Ra and the Hermetica and the Memphis creation account, all of which I've read. I've read all that. So just because it says that Ra created with his word, that's the only similarity. Nothing else is similar. God does not create creation as a part of him. In the Egyptian account, it's all pantheism. Literally, creation is just another manifestation or part of God. We do not believe creation is a part of God. God is wholly separate from creation, although he is also immanent, right? So he's immanent through his divine energies, but in his holy nature, he is transcendent. He is separate from creation. So we don't have dialectics, right? And then all of the other pagan views will enter into dialectics. This is another key factor. Evolution is based on dialectics. It's based on competing forces in nature, creating, supposedly propelling one group above another, right? The fittest. Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, dualism, these are all based on dialectical tensions between two opposing principles. Light and dark, good and evil, black and white, whatever, male, female. No, we don't have dialectics. We don't have any dialectics in our view. None whatsoever, because all dialecticism has the same basis and ground as paganism. So from the outset, our God is not only distinct, he's not only creating ex nihilo, he's not only sovereign over his creation, he's not battling against it, he's not halfway equal to it or whatever. It's not accidental. Creation wasn't an abortion or something like this from the Gnostics. On top of all that, our God is not an impersonal force. This is also unique. The gods and forces of the ancient Near Eastern pagan world were not personal gods. Now, when I say this, you'll say, oh, but Zeus was personal. No. Zeus is a personified force of nature, or a personified guy at one time, right? I mean, Hercules was probably just some buff dude, or maybe a giant of Genesis 6 or something like this. Who knows exactly what Hercules originally, but he was a dude at one time, and he became deified into the status of the gods, right? That's not what we say God is. From the outset, in the Genesis account, God is not presented like Zeus. He is completely, totally different and distinct from Zeus, because another unique aspect, none of the other pagan deities taught that God was omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent, right? And we have in Genesis already the teaching that that's who our God is. Do you understand that? Right? The pagans did not teach that their God had the omnis, and that he was personal, that he could enter into a relationship with his creation. All of the other deities are basically just tyrant gods like their Middle Eastern kings, right? He's not just, he's not holy. He does not do the things that the Bible God does, right? He is not, Zeus is basically just a big guy, a tyrant, right? But that is not the kind of God that we see the biblical God presented as. He is completely different from Zeus. So this is another mistake that the pagans make. Why not just believe in Zeus? Well, for all the reasons I've listed in the last 45 minutes here, or 30 minutes here, Zeus does not create ex nihilo. Zeus is not separate from creation. Zeus is not spirit. Zeus is not all-knowing. Zeus is not anything like the biblical presentation of God. Zeus is a tyrant who engages in bestiality and incest, right? All these things that we think are terrible, right? Zeus doesn't create ex nihilo. Zeus is not the friend of man. Zeus is a tyrant. Man is an accidental abortion in the Greek pagan view. So there's the only way that they want similarities is just to try to refute the religion by coming up with what they think is a similarity. But there's far more dissimilarity than there is similarity between these views. there's really no similarity between Greek paganism or the Odyssey, right, and Homer and what you read in the Bible. I mean, anybody familiar with both texts, right, with Homer and with the Bible, knows that these are not similar texts at all. They don't describe similar things. They're very dissimilar. So, if we want to recap a bit here, as we said, creation is revealed. It's not a natural philosophical speculation that one comes to. It is revealed. It is accepted on the basis of divine authority. Creation, in our view, is unique. It is not like the pagan and atheist conceptions of where we get things. If you think about the absurdity of the Big Bang, it has no purpose. There's absolutely no basis for it. It's completely based on speculation. The radiometric and the UV light ray claims of how they think that the universe is expanding, that's all completely highly speculative, right? It has little to no foundation whatsoever. I've had all these college classes, so I'm not just speaking out of my butt here. I know what I'm talking about. And once you just simply question their presuppositions of how they come to these conclusions, the whole measuring system falls apart. It's utterly faulty, right? It's based on a whole host of assumptions that they don't even question. They just assume these things are so, and then therefore that determines how the measurement system works. We'll go into that more eventually down the road. We're not going to do that right now, but the point here is that we're doing a kind of introduction to theology. Some of this is apologetics, but this is Genesis and the introduction to theology. So our God is not an architect. Matter is not part of him. We don't believe in pantheism. He creates out of his own goodness. This is another aspect to which our view is unique. God is not an accidental creator. He's not creating because he needs something to punish. He creates out of his own goodness. The goodness of God is the reason for creation. And thus, as a result, when God creates, he says numerous times in Genesis and in the rest of the scriptures that creation is good. It is inherently good. There is no inherent evil. Evil has no substantial ontological existence. Evil is a privation or a move of the will away from the good. That's it. That's all evil is for us. So evil is not part of creation. It's not an aspect of creation. Evil doesn't have any substantial existence or power apart from when it's actually committed. We don't believe that death existed prior to the fall. This is important because we don't believe in uniformitarianism. All naturalistic assumptions about the world believe in usually some form of uniformitarianism, although sometimes they will say they don't believe this. They say there could have been a period when quote, natural laws or forces or principles operated differently than they do now. And half the time the atheist naturalists will say that it wasn't uniform, and then they'll turn around in other examples and say that it was uniform. So if the moon is moving away from the earth at an inch a year or whatever it is, they are suddenly not uniformitarian because, a million billion years ago, that would mean that the moon collides with the earth. And so they say, oh, we are not uniformitarian when it comes to the moon. However, when it comes to measuring the light, supposedly, and the distance of stars, suddenly they're uniformitarian and everything has been moving at the exact same rate and principle. So they do what's called special pleading. This is a fallacy where you move the goalposts to fit your evidence. They accuse Christians and theists of this. They do it all the freaking time. They assume uniformitarianism when it comes to radiometric dating, right? But they don't ever address this. They just move the goalpost whenever it fits their situation. And then they say that they accuse us of doing what they do. We do not believe in uniformitarianism precisely because there was a fall. And the state of things prior to the fall is different than after. So we don't believe that mosquitoes were always functioning in a parasitic way. We don't believe that animals were always eating other animals. Things were different before the fall, and we don't know exactly what it was like then. So when Jordan Peterson says, is Genesis mythological? Well, again, depends on what you mean. It describes a different way of living and state of being before the entrance of death, right, than it does after the fall. So we're only kind of given faint images and references to how things were prior to the fall. And that actually makes sense, because how would Genesis describe Eden to us anyway? We have no experience of Eden. So in other words, if the Bible's true, and if Eden was in a different state of being, then the way it's described in Genesis is exactly what we would expect. We would expect some faint impressions and images from the way things operated. We don't know exactly what kind of a serpent Lucifer was. We don't know exactly how this went down. But in some way, there was some connection between the serpent and Lucifer, or Satan, in the garden. And that's how the temptation went down. But again, at that time, there was not a separation between spirit and matter, between humans and spirit, as there is now after the fall. So even the metaphysics of creation itself was different before the fall. And this is very important for our worldview, right? This is why we think that after the fall, you have the introduction of things like catastrophes. Not just the flood, but it looks like the heavenly bodies themselves are beat to heck, right? They're full of asteroids and craters and holes, and the universe, it looks beat up, and that's because of the fall. And the fall wasn't just something that affected a guy in the ancient Near East. It was universal in scope. The fall affected the entire universe, and thus death entered the entire universe. So the metaphysics of the whole of creation is affected by the fall, including matter itself. This is very important, because this is very distinct from all the other worldviews out there. The other worldviews don't believe this. They believe that death is natural. And what happens when death is natural? Well, it's just as powerful and just as good, or maybe even more powerful than life, because in the naturalistic worldview, life is very short and fleeting. You're gone. And so actually death is their God, right? And the Bible even says that, right? All those who hate me love death. They have a covenant with death, right? And that's really the essence of the fallen man's naturalistic, atheistic worldview, is that he is a servant and lover of death. And that's ultimately why they end up worshiping death himself, who is an angel, Satan. Now, I mentioned that we've only gotten really to Genesis 1, 1, and 2, and I was recapping, and I want to make the point as well that we also see that the doctrine of creation necessarily lays down laws and principles. And laws and principles in nature are a good thing. So for us, this is why there is regularity in nature. This is why we can do science, is because science is regular. It's regular, it's ordered, and then we have the principle of induction. Man made in the image of God can learn about the world. He can use his reason. He can use his mind, etc. Even after the loss of the likeness of God, we're told that man is made in the image and likeness of God. In Orthodox theology, when man fell, he lost that likeness, or the divine communion, the divine life, but he retained his natural life. He retained a natural state, subject to death and corruption, still, however, with the image of God there. So man can still do certain things. He's still bound by moral laws and principles. If you commit suicide, you will die. You will end your life. If you take heroin, you will become addicted and it will destroy you, right? I mean, there are these principles, these patterns, and there is retribution, even still in this life, for your actions. Even if you do not believe in God, you are still liable and you will still pay the penalty for these actions. And that's because God set all of this up to be the way that it is. And so what we see is that early on, law and morals are present in the beginning. Law and morals do not evolve. They do not come from social convention. They do not arise from the consensus of some past majority or some tyrant. They do not arise through personal opinion. Morals and laws and principles are objective, implanted in the world, and they function on the basis of the mind of God. That's the basis for them. The divine mind that is behind all of creation. Everything that's created is created on the principle of the logoi, or the patterns or the archetypes or the forms or the universals that are in the mind of God. They are not the essence of God. They are not Plato's forms. They are different. They are patterns, archetypes, and principles of all the created things. They are the divine icons of all created things in the mind of God. And so ultimately, at root, everything has its origin, its basis, and its ground in the mind of God. They do not arise out of nowhere and then disappear into nothingness again. Everything that exists, because it is fundamentally rational, that is how the mind of man can understand it. That's how there's a bridge from the external world to the internal world of my mind. If Darwinism is true, if atheism is true, I can't learn about anything in the external world because it has no inherent substance, meaning, or essence that I can connect my thought to. There's no bridge between my thought process and the eternal flux of matter out there in the external world. You must have logos and logoi and a personal omniscient God for knowledge to even be possible. This is the kind of God that we're presented with in Genesis. No other world religion presents a God like this. Atum Ra does not fit this category. Atum Ra is just a pantheistic all or nothing meaninglessness. He means all and he means nothing at once. If you read the Hermetica, there's no coherent basis behind what Atum Ra is. He's not a being that you can have a relationship with. He is all things and he is no thing. And that's why it falls off ultimately into something like Hinduism or Far Eastern Buddhism. All of those religions, because they're absolute, their ultimate metaphysical principle is impersonal, or just some force or some non-existence or some negation, all of those religions are self-refuting. They make ultimate reality irrational. Only a God with an only a God with omniscience and with logos, with reason, with thought, right? That our thought mirrors. We're a little image, a little icon, a little mirror of God. We can get an inkling of this from our reasoning. Our reasoning is a transcendental argument for God because it shows the big logos. We're a little logos. Jesus is the big logos. And so that's you want proof for God's existence? Your own mind is a proof of God's existence, and not just a proof of some generic God, but the God of Genesis, the God who creates, as Colossians 1 says, mirroring Genesis 1 and mirroring John 1, according to all the principles of the Logos. The logoi are the principles behind all things made in unison with the Logos. I don't mean that the Logos is created. I'm saying that in the Logos there are the principles of all things, right? The eternal patterns of all things. And so creation is patterned after the Logos. That's why God the Father made all things through him and in the Spirit. And that's why and how law, moral law, 10 Commandments are present and operative in nature. I'm saying that in the human realm, obviously animals do not obey the commands given to Moses. But what I'm saying is that the 10 Commandments is not something added on. The 10 Commandments, the basics of the moral law, are present prior to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And this is shown by the fact that all the time from Genesis up to Moses, right, from Adam to Noah to Moses, people are held accountable for these things. They're held accountable to obey their parents. They're held accountable to obey God, to not have idols, right? All of these things are principles that are operant even prior to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and that's because they're implanted in creation, in nature. That's how Paul can say in Romans 1 that nature itself teaches us that idols are wrong. Nature itself teaches us that homosexuality is wrong. He's not saying nature in the sense of naturalistic atheism and you look at animals and you see predator and prey. No, he's talking about The natural world as a whole testifies to the inner heart of hearts to man. It testifies to, in his inner heart of hearts, that there is a God, and that man is morally culpable and responsible to that God, and that he must live by his laws. But however, the laws are not enough, right? Just having rules and principles of right and wrong is not enough to save man from death. And this is why we're going to have in Genesis 3 what's called the Protoevangelium, the promise to Eve that her seed will destroy the serpent. That, of course, is the Messiah. And it will be very obvious that Genesis 3:15 is about Jesus. Who else would it be? Why do you think the Gospels contain the genealogies from Adam all the way to Jesus? It's to show you that he is the seed. This is the whole message of the Bible, all throughout. This is the message of why the tyrants are trying to stamp out God's people. It's not because Jews are magical in themselves, they have super DNA. It's because they're the race that's going to produce the Messiah that Satan wants to destroy, right? That's the whole battle of history. But as we said, that's getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get into Genesis 3 and what's called the Protoevangelium, or the gospel ahead of time, when we get to hour 2 for subscribers. But for right now, it serves our purpose to see that man is a little icon or image of God. This is partly why we have icons. Man is a type, also he pre-signifies the incarnation, right? People think, how is it possible? Jews would say it's not possible for God to become incarnate. Well, if he can make man in his image, of course he can. Right? If God can step into time and history and space in the Shekinah, and he can cover the temple with his glory, and he can give a law at Mount Sinai, stepping into time and space, if he can reveal himself in the burning bush to Moses and say, I am that I am, then he can become incarnate. Of course he can. If he can create the world, he can become incarnate. He can do anything because he's God. And by the way, when we say God can do anything, it is limited, right? This is a kind of a dumb atheist thing. Can God make the rock big enough that he can't lift it? God is limited by his own nature. So it's actually not true to say that God is in no sense limited. He's actually limited by his own character, by his own attributes. So God can't, for example, make himself not exist, right? So what it means to be omnipresent or omnipotent or whatever is itself limited by God himself, because he is the all conditioner. He is the final source, the ultimate ground of the worldview as a whole, of our religion. And so he is the final status, not just for life and morals, but also for what it means to be omniscient. God himself determines omniscience. There's not some category of omniscience that God submits to, right? It's God himself that is omniscient. So in the same way, the nature, the world, the created realm that he brought into being, it's also implanted with principles. It's also implanted with meaning. It's implanted with purpose and telos because of God. And when you remove God from your worldview, you lose all this stuff. And your worldview becomes incoherent. It becomes foolishness. It becomes what Paul says it becomes. Right? The wisdom of this world is foolishness. And as Proverbs says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. If you don't have the fear of the Lord, you lose all this. You might get something right about earthworms. You might get something right in your engineering. You might get something right in this and that. But your worldview as a whole is going to be incoherent. It's not going to make any sense. You're going to try to have right and wrong in a world with no right and wrong, with no ultimate principles. You're going to contradict and be made a fool. And that's the job of apologetics, to show how unbelieving worldviews are nonsense. And really, it begins in Genesis. This is why we have to believe and defend the Genesis narrative. And every one of you that does not believe it and defend it and tries to maintain religion and Christianity or whatever, you're doomed. You're going to fail. You will be made foolish by an intelligent unbeliever. And you will eventually apostatize. That's what happens to these people. These people who don't believe this, they don't believe that, they eventually doubt the whole thing, and they're made fools of. But we see again that our doctrine is very clear. Our doctrine is present from the beginning. if you read the excellent book by, which I eventually will cover this entire book. We will do, sorry about that. We will do Genesis, Creation, Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose. But the church fathers also comment on this. It is not true that the church fathers all teach allegory and that Genesis isn't history. That is not true. It's a bunch of baloney. And it's only modernists who say that, and they're lying. I was just reading a guy the other day who was quoting St. Basil's Hexameron, trying to show that St. Basil didn't believe in 7-day creation. Yes, he did. The whole work, Hexameron, is about a literal 6-day, 7-day creation. Total liars everywhere. They're all just a bunch of freaking liars. Everybody's a bunch of liars everywhere. Stop lying. Stop lying. And stop lying to yourself. That whole work is about literal 6-day creation. That's the whole point of the book. And you're going to try to quote from that to show that Basil didn't believe in 7-day creation? Yes, he did. But of course, if you haven't actually read that, you would be duped by that. You would believe because some priest said that oh, it must be true. I guess Basil didn't. No, don't believe these lying priests. Just because somebody wears a cassock doesn't mean they're right. And by the way, that's why they don't teach you and tell you the things that I'm telling you. Is because they don't have it. They don't have the goods. They've lost the wisdom and the knowledge that they would have if they feared the Lord and they believed the text. But they don't, and so they're made foolish. So God creates a world. He creates a kind of tabernacle, right? And so what we're going to see, actually, this is a very fascinating thing, that at Mount Sinai, God's going to do a kind of recreation. So the first creation falls, and God will be in the process of recreating, reforming the world that he made, ultimately, obviously, to be consummated in Christ, right? Who will be the true tabernacle of God with man. But at this period, we are awaiting there's a kind of pattern that we see in Scripture of giving of the land, falling away, or a fall, a period of wandering, and then a period of restoration. This is a very obvious, very, very constant biblical theme and pattern of blessing, of fall, wandering, exodus, and then restoration. Right? This will happen over and over and over. And ultimately, this pattern is fulfilled, obviously, in Christ and in eternity, ultimately. But at this point, here in Genesis, we have the fall, and then God will, at Exodus, pronounce 10 new sayings. So in Genesis, you have let there be 10 times. God speaks 10 times. It's not accidental that in Exodus, when he gives the 10 commands, he speaks 10 times. That is a recreation, a making anew, a restoration, right? A new creation, in other words. And the new creation will be the new covenant in Christ, who gave the law at Mount Sinai, right? Which shows that Jesus is who created, right? Now, in hour 2, we will get deeper into all that, and we will look at the typology of Eve as a type of Mary, Eve as a type of the church, because she comes from the side of Adam, right? The church comes out of the side of Christ because Christ is pierced and blood and water come forth. This is the blood of the Eucharist and the water of baptism. All this typology, we will see what that means. And all will be explained and fulfilled in the New Testament and in the writings of the Church Fathers, as we'll see. And we will also discuss the fall of the angels, which there was an angelic fall first. And this is how Satan is there to tempt Adam in the garden, because the angels had already experienced their testing, their temptation, and their fall. And then we will see the full meaning of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 in explaining our origins and how crucial it is to have Genesis 1, 2, and 3 right in order to make sense of the coming of Christ. If you don't have Genesis 1, 2, and 3 right, Jesus' coming makes no sense. There was no point in it, or it's all screwed up, or it's all ahistorical, it's all symbolic, and you've destroyed the whole gospel and you're a heretic. So very important. We can't just make up what we want to be the case. We don't come to the Bible with our secular presuppositions and read into it what we think ancient histories did. We don't read into this that Israel developed monotheism out of polytheism. No, it's the other way around. The original religion is always monotheism. Universal idolatry is a corruption of monotheism. And it's not meaningless impersonal force monotheism. It's personal God from the beginning. So secular history is all wrong. They're all backwards. It's all baloney. They don't know what they're talking about because they don't have revelation. You can't interpret the past, the present, and the future without revelation. And that's why all the secular theories are just as dumb as the pagan theories. And they're just as superstitious. The secular, naturalist interpretations of the world are just as or more superstitious than ancient paganism, and they have the same doctrines. The exact same. Man as an abortion. Man as an accident. Man as nothing but bubbling forth chemicals. And somehow there's all this programmed DNA, super computer level stuff going on inside of these bodies and organisms. That's all just random chance that brought it. I mean, it's just, come on. Nobody but a complete fool would believe that. So what you see here is that our view is unique. We have this whole dogma that goes into our understanding of Genesis. And it is not what the zeitgeist people think. It is not what the comparative religion scholars think. It's not what Freemasons think. It's the Freemasons that teach that all the religions arose out of some generic polytheism. No, it did not. Stop trying to say Masonic doctrine. We don't believe that. I know plenty of Christians who think that. They think that ancient history in Genesis is just myths, and that the history of religions is this progress from polytheism and animism to monotheism to Christianity and Judaism to secularism. No, do you know who came up with that? Enlightenment philosophers. They just made that up because they don't believe this. I hear Christians say this. That's Auguste Comte. Right? That's what the Frankfurt School teaches. They teach that in the writings of Horkheimer and Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment. No, we don't believe any of that. They're all wrong. And they're wrong because they're fools. Because once you reject God, you are made a fool. You're not just made a fool in a religious, moral sense. You're made a fool in an intellectual sense. That's why I don't get afraid of ever debating any atheists. Because there are only a couple options once you become an atheist. You automatically lock yourself into a box to where you only have a couple positions to go with. You only have a certain way to go with materialism and with finitude and with meaninglessness, no purpose, no telos, no morals. There's like 3 or 4 options, and that's all you have. And all of those options are dead ends. So it has nothing to do with, I'm not afraid of debating atheists because I'm so smart. No, it's literally because the wisdom of this world is foolishness. Because once you adopt presuppositions consonant with atheism and you follow through logically with it, you only have about 3 dumb options in your world, in your worldview as a whole. And they're all stupid. And you will be made foolish, especially since I know how to debate it. So no, I'm not afraid of debating JF. I'm not afraid of debating Infidel Pharaoh. I'm not afraid of debating Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, because they all have the same presuppositions and you only have a couple options. You lock yourself in a box with that dumb worldview and you will necessarily entail yourself into logical absurdities. So, Genesis is where we begin. This is how we start our theology. Our theology is not natural theology. It's not philosophical speculations. It's revealed. And if you don't believe that, if you don't start with it being revealed, you can't do the Thomist thing of stacking on supernatural on top of nature. Because the starting point is supernatural. It's not natural. You don't start with natural theology. Does Genesis start with natural theology? No. How stupid. Right. So our theology is there from the beginning. It's revelational. It's supernatural from the beginning. It is a worldview. It will entail the entirety of Revelation, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Deuterocanon, and sacred tradition in the Orthodox Church. It hits the whole package. You can't pick piecemeal out this and that what you want. And it does include Mosaic authorship. That doesn't mean that we know that Moses sat down and literally wrote every single text, because it records Moses' death. So someone like Joshua afterwards obviously wrote more onto the Torah itself. But Jesus says Moses wrote the law. So we believe in Mosaic authorship. Otherwise, Jesus was wrong and the Gospels are wrong. The history of the church affirms Mosaic authorship. And you can't have the New Testament without the 5 books of Moses. And when the higher critics attacked the 5 books of Moses, they knew that. They're smarter than the dumb Christians are. They knew that once they attacked that, they'd had the whole thing wrapped up. Because they knew that the New Testament cites the Old. But dumb Christians think that you can attack Moses and the Bible and the Old Testament and still retain Jesus. No, you can't. Stop being stupid and naive. This is why we're ruled over by idiots. Is because we are weak. That's why. So creation is revealed. Creation is a doctrine in which God has reflected his own character and standards and purpose into his creation, especially man, the pinnacle of his creation. Man ultimately is even of a higher status in the long run than the angels. We're not right now, as the psalmist says, he made us a little lower than the angels. But in the long run, Paul says, we will judge the world and we will even judge the angels. So the end purpose for which God created man is even higher than the angels. This is why Satan hates man. It's because of the envy of the devil. From the beginning, it was known that Christ would become incarnate. He would have become incarnate even if there had not been a fall, because this was God's purpose all along, was to become incarnate. This is where we differ from Thomism. We don't teach the Roman Catholic nonsense. The whole purpose all along was the incarnation. From the foundation of the world, the purpose was for all of creation to be the church. And it will be. That's the greatness of God's restoration of all things, the recapitulation, which the West no longer teaches, by the way. We still teach the recapitulation, as all the Orthodox fathers do. And that means that Christ will restore to the same extent that Adam destroyed. So the restoration of Christ, according to Romans 8, is universal in scope. He is the cosmic redeemer, right? This is why St. Maximus writes about the cosmic liturgy, right? It's God's cosmos. The whole cosmos is a liturgy. Think about that for a moment. And that's what Genesis is teaching us. Genesis begins liturgy. Genesis is liturgy. God sets up the luminaries, the heavenly luminaries, for times, dates, and seasons. That's a liturgical calendar. That's why the week, the 7-day week, is liturgy. Did you know that? Did you know that the 7-day week is a liturgical time frame? Yes, it is. We will get into that more. Liturgy is worship, by the way, the service of worship. And the entire creation is God's liturgy, including the angels and including man. And we will cover that in hour 2. Now, you don't get any of this in the other churches and the other sects and then the heresies. They don't teach any of this stuff because they've lost all this. That's why. It's not hard to figure out. They've lost the Orthodox teaching. But as you can see in this talk, our doctrine is unique. We're not pagans. We're very different. We teach ex nihilo. None of them do. We teach that fundamental reality is grounded in the mind of God. It's not just flux. It's not just dead matter. There's no such thing as dead matter. The whole universe will be restored in the incarnation. That was the purpose of it, which is the down payment on the resurrection, right? The giving of the Spirit at Pentecost is the preparation for the restoration of all things in the resurrection. And the resurrection is not just the bodily resurrection of the righteous. It's the renovation of the entire universe, according to Romans 8. You see the scope, the universal scope, right? Very different from Western deformed Christianity and its heresies. All right, that's it for this first hour. In hour 2, we will continue more in Genesis. You've been listening to Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. If you want to hear the full talk, you can subscribe for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. The second hour is usually up the next day, so please don't email me tonight asking where it is. It takes a long time to study and prepare and produce all of these. It will be up either tonight or tomorrow, and it will go out to subscribers and be available in the archives. You can get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. You can subscribe to my TV show, Hollywood Decoded, at Gaia TV. And my book, Esoteric Hollywood 2, will be out soon. This is not the replacement. This is not the talk on Seraphim Rose's book, Genesis, Creation, and Early Man. This is my talk on Genesis and the introduction to basics of theology. We will get to that book eventually. It's very long. I'm still not totally done with it. I've read a good part of it, maybe 3/4 of it. But we won't do that book until I've completed the whole thing. And we also have to get back to the Globalist book series as well. But we will continue. This is going to be an ongoing series. There's going to be more Genesis talks. We're going to move, up into the totality of Genesis, just like we did with Jeremiah. Obviously, there's a lot more in Genesis. It's packed. It's loaded. There's a lot to dissect in Genesis. A lot of controversial, difficult stuff. We're going to try to make our way through it, God willing. And I want to say God bless you all. Thank you for listening. And for those who want more on these topics, you can look at the Jay's Analysis recommended reading list. I'm constantly adding and updating that, so there will be more material there as well. Thank you for listening, and look for hour 2.